It is Tuesday, January 22nd, 2019. My name is Ashton Ellett, here with another installment of the Two-Party Georgia Oral History Project, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia. Joining me today is Professor Trey Hood. Dr. Hood is a professor of political science in the University of Georgia's School of Public and International Affairs. He also serves as the director of SPIA's Survey Research Center, a nationally recognized polling operation with a primary focus on the policy priorities and political attitudes of Georgians. He is also the author of The Rational Southerner, Black Mobilization, Republican Growth, and Partisan Transformation of the American South. Thank you very much, Trey, for taking some time to talk about the 2018 election cycle.
Sure, glad to be here.
So let's jump right into it. How did 2018 and the 2018 election cycle compare to past elections that you've either covered or studied? Try to put that into context or historical context for us.
Yeah, I think it's pretty unique, especially compared to other midterm elections. The last number of midterm elections, and of course, Georgia's electing constitutional offices, including governor, lieutenant governor, and secretary of state, those kind of offices in off years. Last time you had Nathan Deal running for re-election, sort of, part and parcel, sort of plain vanilla type of Republican candidate, won fairly easily over a Democratic challenger. Turnout was fairly low, and turnout in midterm cycles is lower than for presidential cycles.
Do you know what the average is for Georgia?
Well, I don't know, but I did look at the turnout in 2014 was 43% of registered voters.
Okay, and it was around 65 for this past.
61.
61, okay.
Yeah,
still a marked increase.
Yes.
From 2014.
Yes, so turnout was way up in this election cycle. It was an open seat for governor as well as some of these other constitutional offices like lieutenant governor, secretary of state. And so it was a very hotly contested election cycle, and the Democrats really in the state ramped up their operations, and I guess you could say the Republicans responded in kind. So turnout goes up, and the Democratic candidate Stacey Abrams, black female, so this would have been historic if she'd been elected anywhere, right? As the first black woman leading the state as governor. Of course, that didn't quite happen, but nevertheless, there was a lot of national media and money focused on this Georgia election. So it was very much in play, and it did turn out to be very close. Kemp barely squeaks by, not having to be involved in a runoff election. I think he gets 50.3 or 50.2% of the final vote count. And of course, in Georgia, we're the only state that I'm aware of that in a general election where you have to also win a majority of the vote to avoid a runoff. And so he barely does that. But the election's very close. I don't know if you want to talk about some of the polling we did.
That was my next question. Let me go ahead and pause it 1 second. So was this the first election cycle that you've covered with SRC?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So tell me about the process. What are the internal workings of a polling operation, a public polling operation like yours?
Okay, well this was all contract work with the Atlanta Journal-Constitution.
Okay.
So we're working with them. They're actually paying us to conduct these polls. And last year was very busy. The last calendar year, I think we did 7 polls for the AJC. We always start out the year doing what they call a pre-legislative poll, to sort of give people an idea of, how some of the issues being talked about in the legislature are going to play with the public or not play with the public.
Right.
But then pretty immediately we had a Republican and Democratic primary poll in the spring last year. And then, of course, when the Republican primary went to a runoff, we had a Republican primary runoff poll in the summer in July. And then we did 3 election polls in the fall leading up to the 2018 general. So again, we had a very busy season. And election polls are different from just sort of a general survey of the public, because what you have to do in addition to trying to get a gauge on how people are voting is to try to figure out a turnout model. And again, when we weight things on the back end of an election poll, what we're trying to figure out is what we think the turnout model is going to look like. And again, you're making an educated, I don't want to say guess, but you're making an educated.
It's an inference.
You know, usually with me based on past elections about who's turning out. And again, so the weighting is very important in these kinds of polls. So
I remember conversations of if Stacey Abrams and the Democrats wanted to be successful, they had to have African-American, the African-American turnout or portion of the electorate had to be somewhere close to 29 to 31, 32%. Where did you weight the poll?
Yeah, they were saying up to like 31 or maybe even 32%. I weighted the poll based on what black turnout was in the 2014 midterm because that was the most proximate election we had to look at. And it turned out that because of that, we were only about 0.2 of a percentage point off. So black turnout was up, but just slightly over the 2014 numbers.
Interesting. So we mentioned off camera that these are all live phone calls.
Right. Live interviewer surveys.
How is that different than some of the other polling operations?
Well, it varies widely. Now, again, legally to call cell phone numbers, you have to have a live interviewer. So that's one of the reasons we're definitely using live interviewer surveys. But they're still the gold standard in the survey industry. And of course, that makes the cost of the survey more.
Sure.
We're calling about at least 65 to 70% cell phone numbers now, just because, you know, landline numbers are great. People answer more often with landline numbers, and we can more easily locate them geographically. But if we're not calling cell phone numbers at this point, we're not getting a representative sample of the population we're trying to reach. So as more and more people, even older people, ditch their landlines and, you know, just have a cell phone number now. So we have to do that. I mean, what are some other alternatives? Hybrid surveys, online surveys, surveys where a computer calls numbers. Now, they're not legally supposed to call cell phone numbers. Sometimes I think they do. But, you know, if you're just using a computer-generated survey to call landlines, that's problematic, especially nowadays. So, because you're going to get an older subset of the population.
I was just getting ready to ask, who picks up phone calls from UGA's polling operation? Do we know who picks up versus others, and how do you control for that?
Well, the biggest way we control for it is weighting on the back end. You know, we're usually light on younger voters, and again, that's a category that would be pretty much cell phone only.
Yeah.
And we found that a lot of people in that generation just will not answer the phone if they don't recognize the phone number. So, so it's a problem that we just have to work through.
How did you account? Because I remember the last poll came out just days before the election. How in your polling model do you account for the number of voters who had already cast ballots? Is there a way to work that? Okay.
Yeah, we asked them. So at that point, when the early voting period in Georgia starts, you have to ask them, have you already voted or are you going to vote? And then we ask them about their likelihood of voting. So we're dropping people who are saying we're probably not going to vote in the election. Those aren't likely voters. So we have quite a number of screening questions. If they say they've already voted, then they segue off into another branch of the survey, and we ask them who they voted for. So that's definitely got to be controlled for. You know, Georgia has a 3-week early voting period.
Right.
And so we're definitely picking up people that have already cast a ballot at that point.
So, how precise, you know, coming out of the last poll that you had, where were Kemp and Abrams at, more or less, in that last poll, which was like November 1, November 2?
Yes, now I can't remember the specific percentages, but she was ahead of Kemp in our poll by 0.2 of a percentage point.
Which is well within.
Yeah, I
any
mean, so
margin
we
of
would
error.
say it's a statistical tie.
Sure.
Her vote percentage cannot be differentiated from his vote percentage.
Gotcha.
And of course, it did turn out to be a very close election, which is what the poll was saying.
Right.
So,
And that was a poll of likely voters as opposed to registered voters?
likely voters. Yeah, anytime we're doing an election poll, we're doing a poll of likely voters.
Because if you look at different polls, there are some pollsters who still run with registered voting numbers. Is that just for the sake of cost and ease of doing the poll? Because I assume it's easier to just poll registered voters as opposed to likely voters.
Yeah, it is easier. But again, that's not what you should be doing if you're doing an election poll and you're trying to predict the outcome of an election. You're trying to get in contact with people who are, again, likely to show up to vote or again, as you just said, maybe already had voted.
Right. So what did you learn from this election cycle? Did you learn anything new that'll help inform the polling operation going into 2019 and 2020?
Well, I will say that, before we started any of these general election polls, I had a protocol written out, and I just followed my protocol, and whatever the numbers were at the end of the protocol I went through were the numbers, and I think that's a good way to do it. So you're figuring out your weighting scheme and all that ahead of time, and then you just run the numbers through it. What did I learn? Well, the whole process was somewhat stressful for me, I should say, because I've said it many times, we're not very good at predicting the future. Even a one outcome solution, a dichotomous solution, this or that. We're not very good sometimes at predicting the future. And so there's nothing to check this against except maybe other polls. But again, you're not conducting those other polls.
Right.
So there's really nothing to check it against until you get up to the election, and that's, as people say, the real poll. So it was stressful, but again, I think the way to handle it is to think about things ahead of time and set everything up and then just follow your protocol through.
What do you think the public's biggest misconception about polling is, especially coming out of 2016 and 2018?
Well, a lot of people are skeptical, period, about polls, just in general. And a lot of people remember the polls that are wrong.
Right.
So, what our poll was showing is that the election was going to be very close, and we couldn't predict beyond that, and it was very close. And so from that standpoint, we at least got that part of it right. But people tend to remember polls that are off or wrong, and they use that as sort of ammunition to say all polls are wrong, right?
Right. So looking back at the 2018 primaries, it seems like it was a lifetime ago.
Right.
I guess politics seems moves slower than it did in the past, or at least it feels like it. So what was the conventional wisdom going into the Republican primary, gubernatorial primary here in Georgia?
Well, I think the front runner was definitely Casey Cagle, who was, the lieutenant governor, had been the lieutenant governor for 2 terms. Kemp obviously was also in a strong position. He was Secretary of State, for two terms, so another statewide constitutional office. I think the common wisdom was certainly that Cagle was going to win the primary, that he was the front runner.
So what do you think explains Cagle's collapse? And I say collapse knowing that he ran ahead in the original primary, but was under 40%. What do you think explains that?
I think collapse is a pretty good word. I mean, at least from some of the graphics I've seen put together of polls after the fact, at least, because Cagle's numbers just almost go off of a cliff,
right?
And Kemp's numbers are steadily rising. There were a number of things. There was a secret tape which was somewhat damaging.
The Clay Tippins
tape, where he's basically admitting to playing politics with some issues. And, it's not as though, I don't think that shocked people, but the admission on tape, was hard to get around.
Right.
Kemp also ran some very savvy advertisements in the Republican primary runoff, appealing to Republican primary voters.
Right.
So they were pretty far right commercials, but again, he's appealing to a certain segment, and they were very clever. Some people didn't like them, but again, he's appealing to certain people, and I thought they were very clever advertisements. And then Trump, Pence does come to the state to stump for Kemp, and Trump comes out and endorses Kemp. So all these things are happening fairly closely in time. So it's hard to say it's any one thing. It's probably a confluence of events. But those are some of the things that sort of led Cagle's support to collapse. I think he only won 2 of 159 counties in Georgia, if I remember correctly. So,
what do you think explains that sort of margin of victory, which most people were surprised at how the numbers I think are lost to me. It's over 25%. Margin of victory for Kemp in the runoff.
Right. I don't remember specifically.
Yeah, I
either,
don't remember the specific.
It was big.
It was a massive.
It was big.
Did you poll the runoff?
Yes. Now again, things were very dynamic and changing. We had. I'm sorry. I guess we could look this up.
Yeah.
But we had Kemp up about 2.5, I think, percentage points over Cagle, which again would have still been within the margin of error. But I saw a graphic where Greg Bluestein from the AJC had strung together a bunch of polls over time after the fact, and our poll tracks with the changing trend of where Kemp is going up and Cagle's going down.
So the trajectory is there, even if it's not
it's picking up that.
Yeah. Is it harder to poll a July runoff election 9 weeks after the original prime? Does the timing matter in terms of polling for voters or for polling?
Well, I think
voters?
the timing always matters to some degree. Was it harder? Yes, in some ways. You're trying to reach a fairly small subset of voters, even voters. So, our primary emphasis was trying to reach people who had just voted in the Republican primary, because those would be the people most likely to also turn around, some smaller subset of that group, and vote in the Republican primary runoff.
Right.
It doesn't mean that there weren't other people who had not participated in the Republican primary who may have voted in the Republican primary runoff. But again, we're trying to reach the bulk of people. And so that's who we were targeting in that particular poll. And again, we're asking them screening questions. What's the likelihood of you turning out to vote in the 2018 Republican primary runoff? And again, if they don't indicate that they're likely or very likely to vote in that runoff, we're going to drop them from the sample. So.
Interesting. So what about the Democratic side of the gubernatorial primary? You already mentioned, Stacey Abrams and the historic nature of her candidacy. Were you surprised at all in the outcome between Stacey Abrams and Stacey Evans in the Democratic primary?
Not really. I mean, our poll showed that Abrams had a huge lead over Evans. And so that was one place where the margin was so large, it was pretty easy to say that Abrams was going to win, and she does win very handedly. So I wasn't that surprised about that outcome.
So what do you think that tells us? You've studied Georgia politics and political history. What does that tell you about the different approach that Stacey Abrams ran opposed to Stacey Evans, which was much more in the Roy Barnes, Buddy Darden sort of centrist Democratic mold? What does that tell you about the approach taken by the winning candidate and the future of this strategy that seems to have fallen by the wayside after several decades?
Well, you're exactly right. I mean, that had been sort of the traditional kind of strategy used by the Democrats in Georgia to mobilize Democratic voters and to attract enough moderate voters to win a majority, right? And Stacey Abrams, it's very interesting, had a completely different strategy, right? She's going to have a very liberal or progressive message, and she's all about mobilizing Democratic voters, especially minorities, younger voters, etc. So it's all about pushing up a turnout model as opposed to persuading moderates to come over to your side. And I guess you could say it almost worked, right? But it's a very interesting change in strategy. So it'll be interesting going forward to see if the Democrats continue that strategy or that line of thought in Georgia.
Compare or contrast that with Brian Kemp's strategy in the general election. Was that also a sort of a base-centric mobilization strategy?
I would say so, yes. I mean, his strongest support's in South Georgia, right? And also had strong support in North Georgia outside of the Atlanta metro area, where Republicans really need to sort of change strategies, if you will, is to try to re-attract some of these metro Atlanta voters, because the Atlanta area just continues to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And there I'm including Cobb and Gwinnett County as well, along with DeKalb, Fulton, and Clayton, and sort of
the older inner suburbs of Atlanta.
Right.
So why do you think, we already talked about 2014 with Nathan Deal and Jason Carter. That race was close at one time, and then the Republican candidate opened up a 6 to 8 point lead in the polls. This race, as you mentioned, that lead didn't open up as it had in 2010 or 2014. Why do you think that is? Why did you think it was a closer race than those previous elections or recent elections?
Well, as you're right, it was closer. It never opened up for the Republican candidates, and I think part of the reason is maybe what we just discussed, this change in strategies, where and again, turnout on both sides went up. Turnout in the midterm went up substantially for a Georgia midterm election. So this is a hypothesis, but it may be due to this change in Democratic strategy, which is again designed to mobilize progressive voters as opposed to persuade moderate voters.
Speaking of making hypotheses, the Libertarian candidate, Ted Metz, basically a non-factor in 2018. I don't even think he got a single percentage point.
Right, I think it was less than 1%.
0.8, 0.9, something like that. I went back and looked at the recent Libertarian candidates for governor. 0.95 was Ted Metz in 2018. Andrew Hunt got 2.4%. John Mons got 4% in 2010. Garrett Hayes got 3.8% in 2006. What do you think explains that? We can't use collapse when we're talking about going from 2 to 0.9%, but an obvious decline in voters choosing a third-party candidate. Do you think
at least in that election?
At least in this election.
At least in that election. Some of it may be due to the fact that some voters are, if the Republican, a lot of libertarians tend to be Republican, maybe not all of them. So some of it may be due to the fact that, if the Republican candidate looks like they're going to win, I'm just going to vote sincerely because I'm really closer to the Libertarian candidate.
Okay.
But, in this election,
it was close.
Things look very close, and maybe I should not vote sincerely, but I should just vote for the Republican candidate because I would favor them more than the Democratic candidate. So strategic voting.
Actual strategic. Yeah. The thing that political scientists and historians always think happens, but voting is such a or sometimes random event because we have no idea why people actually cast their ballots unless they do an exit poll. And then.
Right.
Speaking of exit polls, were any exit polls done in Georgia?
I think there was an exit poll.
There was
as
done
part of a national poll, exit poll.
But that's not something SRC.
We were not involved in that. Exit polls are a whole nother animal. They're very difficult to do. And again, one of the things that's complicated exit polls are early voting. So it's not just on election day anymore. So now you've got to get out there and during the early voting period and try to get people to participate in exit polls.
So what do we know about the actual demographic breakdown of the electorate in 2018?
Well, here's what's interesting. The African-American turnout as a percentage of registered voters only ticked up about 0.2 of a percentage point. So
which seems surprising.
It does. It's right at right below 30%. And even in Obama's best years running for president, black turnout was about 30% in Georgia. So what you're seeing, though, very interestingly, I haven't seen people talk about this, but if you track the numbers from the Secretary of State's office, you're seeing white turnout fall. So it was about 63%, if I remember correctly, in 2014. down to 59% in 2018. So, and again, this is all important if someone's listening, because the party coalitions are so much based on race in the South, especially in the Deep South, with black citizens overwhelmingly Democratic and most white citizens, more than a majority, Republican. So that's why we're talking about this. But here's what's interesting, or at least I think is interesting. There's a slight uptick in the number of Hispanic voters. That's true. So they've gone up to about 2% of the electorate now. They'd been at 1% just a few years ago. But here's what's really interesting. A growing number of people registering as, or not putting down their race when they register to vote. So we don't know who they are. It could be a lot of different people. That's the category that's growing in the electorate. So the share of white registrants is falling due to that number growing. The share of black registrants is fairly flat, really. And we don't know who all these people are. Some of them could be white, they could be black, they could be Hispanic, you know. But I've just noticed that that's sort of an interesting trend.
So what do you think? What do you think is driving? We mentioned the inner suburbs. What do you think is driving those voters in inner suburbs like Cobb, Gwinnett, Henry County towards Democratic candidates at the national level and the state and congressional levels?
Well, I'm always hesitant to talk about, you know, everything being due to demographic change. But in those areas especially, Cobb and Gwinnett especially, seen huge wholesale demographic change. And again, it's been favoring the Democrats for a number of election cycles. And in fact, as you're well aware, in the 6th District, Karen Handel loses. That used to be a very reliable Republican congressional district going all the way back to Newt Gingrich. The 7th District, the Republicans barely managed to hold on there by literally several hundred votes, from what I remember. So again, that's due in large part, I think, to some of these demographic changes in these counties.
And with the 7th District, with Rob Woodall defeating Carolyn Bordeaux, would you attribute that to not Rob Woodall's performance in Gwinnett, which is a rapidly diversifying, rapidly growing county, but it's really it's also anchored there in Forsyth County, which is one of these exurban counties where demographic change is relatively stable with a large majority of white residents and white voters.
Right, and Republican voters. Yeah, Forsyth is overwhelmingly still Republican, and so to have that county in that district, the 7th District, gives the Republicans a better anchor.
Gotcha. Which was not present in the 6th, which is DeKalb, Fulton, and Cobb County, correct?
Right, parts of those counties. And I think we maybe talked about this in the last interview. It's interesting that the city of Atlanta is becoming less and less minority over time, and it's these surrounding counties that are becoming more minority, and then you have these exurban counties that are still very white, right?
Right. I think Cherokee is the largest Republican county in Georgia now, which is amazing to think just a few years ago, because you have to go from Walton County to Cherokee before you hit a Republican county anymore with the growth of Metro Atlanta.
Right. I think Walton County is still way up there.
Walton and Barrow, Winder Barrow. What do you think? What role do you think does President Trump, as the face and the voice of the Republican Party, what role? How can we know or measure the influence that Donald Trump has had on the Georgia electorate?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know that I have a great answer. To some degree, it remains to be seen. I mean, he's mobilized a group of people who had not really been participating in politics all that much. So
and those were?
Disaffected, rural white voters for the most part, at least in Georgia, working class voters. And so you have that coalition along with, what we might call more standard Republicans, middle class, business oriented, those types. what's his long-term effect? I don't know. When he was first elected, I didn't really think he was going to have that big of an effect on the electorate or the party coalition structure, and I'm beginning to change my mind on that. He has a much more populist message, and he's really cutting across the grain with some sort of traditional bread and butter issues that Republicans have supported, like free trade. So, you know, I guess I would say it remains to be seen, but he's having an effect.
Right. Primarily in those suburban, you know, I guess, upwardly mobile, affluent, educated counties. Is that where you've seen the trend away from Republicans to Democrats?
Yes, exactly,
right.
to some degree. So he may be putting off some of that subset of Republicans. Not all of them, certainly.
Sure, sure. So looking at, you know, those statewide offices, I think the highest vote getter was Gary Black, Commissioner of Agriculture. He got 53% roughly of the vote, down to Brad Raffensperger and Chuck Eaton around 49% of the vote. Not much ticket splitting going on.
Right. Very
What do you think that is?
polarized, you know. I mean, just if you're a liberal, you're going to vote Democratic down the ticket. If you're conservative, you're going to vote Republican down the ticket. So, and as you said, not a lot of votes going to the libertarian candidates, which in Georgia have ballot access. So they're actually on the ballot if they're running a candidate
right.
for a particular office.
So looking at the runoff elections, did you poll the runoff? The Secretary of State's runoff?
No, we didn't. We would have, we were getting cycled up to poll if there'd been a Republican, if there'd been a general
right, or the governor
for the governor's race, right, but there wasn't, so.
Well, what does it say, you know, as a political scientist, the dynamics of runoff elections here in Georgia?
Well, we didn't poll, but I wasn't surprised by the outcome at that point. So the Democrats' top vote getter, Stacey Abrams, is out of it at that point. So you don't have that sort of pull, and you've got to try to get voters back to the polls. And at least traditionally, Republicans have been more successful at that than Democrats, and that's what happens in the runoff after the general election.
Yeah, I think the turnout was something like 23%.
Right.
And it was a December runoff. But I was still surprised with how relatively close John Barrow and Lindy Miller were able to keep those races, even with very low turnout. So Republicans are still winning, but are there warning signs for the governing Republican Party here?
Well, I think the 2018 general is a warning sign, you know, of things to come or potentially things to come. Again, I don't like to just make sort of blanket predictions. The electorate is changing, though, and we've been talking about this for decades, really, right? And at some point, it may have an impact. I think it's having an impact, but an impact in terms of actually swinging elections at some point. Now, the electorate doesn't look like the general population or the voting age population or the citizen voting age population or even the population of registrants. So the Republicans still have an edge in terms of turnout in the electorate.
How has early voting changed the dynamics of elections in Georgia?
Well, it changes campaigns. I'm on that question. I'm going to say it really hasn't changed outcomes to any extent. It gives voters a convenient choice to vote early if they want to. Now, what we've found from some past research is that people who've made up their minds, and most of those people are highly partisan, are the people more likely to turn out and vote early. It doesn't mean, of course, that they wouldn't have voted anyway if the election day was the only day they could vote on.
Right.
So not a lot of evidence that early voting's changed outcomes. It does change campaigning in the way that candidates have to respond because, 3 weeks before the election, the voting's actually started.
Right.
So
Does early voting, that 3-week early voting, does it benefit one party over the other, or does it? How does that play out?
I don't really think so, to be honest with you. Haven't seen a lot of evidence to indicate that. I mean, people make arguments one way or the other, but I've not really seen that.
One of the top issues that sort of permeated the entire 2018 election here in Georgia was the topic of voter suppression or alleged voter suppression. So what do we know about how the Secretary of State's office operates, local election boards operates, that feeds into either actual voter suppression or alleged voter suppression here in Georgia?
Right, and you have to also add the legislature into that
Sure.
mix because they're the ones that are authoring the election code. Well, that was a very big issue from the Abrams campaign from the get-go. And again, Brian Kemp is the Secretary of State. So, one of the things they wanted is for Kemp to resign and not oversee the election. But most elections in Georgia are really occurring at the local level, at the county level. So there were a lot of allegations of voter suppression. As we already talked about, turnout really spiked, though, in 2018. At this point, in my mind, they're just allegations. I don't know that anyone was actually being kept from voting. I mean, you always have a situation where some people show up to vote and they haven't followed the proper protocol. In other words, they're registered to vote in one county and they show up in another county. Well, that's not the way elections work in Georgia. I mean, you always have some of that. So
Right.
It's always easy to point to anecdotal examples. I don't think, I think most people who wanted to vote in the 2018 general were certainly able to vote if they registered ahead of time and done everything they needed to do. So there were a lot of allegations. I haven't seen any hard evidence of anyone not being able to participate that was eligible to participate, I guess is the way to put it.
One of you mentioned the anecdotes. I think it was either Gwinnett or Fulton County where the Diebold machines, like they didn't have enough extension cords or power available to them, which gets me to my question, which is, what's going on with Georgia's voting system, and what can we expect in the next round of elections in 2020?
Well, let me just sit back up for
Sure.
just a second and say, look, there are always problems with elections. It doesn't mean there's some kind of conspiracy to suppress voters. Elections are run by thousands of people, and people make mistakes, and sometimes people don't get enough ballots. Sometimes the power goes out. So there's always something happening. But to answer your question, we've had this election system, this DRE system, in place since 2001. So we put it in place after the debacle in Florida,
Right.
the presidential election in 2000. It's going to get changed. I'm almost certain this legislative cycle, they're going to allocate money to reinstitute a new voting system statewide. And one of the things, so there are different alternatives, but one of the things people really want is a physical paper ballot. Whether it's the computer, marking the choices on the ballot, or the voter themselves marking the choices on the ballot, to have something that's actually tangible. And if we did get into a recall situation, or a recount situation, excuse me, we'd actually have those paper ballots to go back to. So I'm fairly certain we're going to have a new voting system put in place, and it's going to include some kind of paper ballot.
Right. I think, there's the days of going, I think when people think of paper ballots, they think of the actual punch card, Chad ballots, but that's not really an option.
They're not punch cards. I mean, we do have scantrons.
Right.
Maybe
Illinois and Missouri, I think, are scantron.
A lot of states actually use
those are the two I'm familiar with.
They actually use scantron ballots. So that's one option. That's where the voter would be filling in the responses. There are more advanced, I say advanced, maybe that's not the best word, but there are other systems where a paper ballot's generated with the aid of a computer. So a person will be touching choices, and those choices will get translated into a real paper ballot.
Okay.
And so that's another option.
And but both of which you could actually audit, as you
right.
said.
You have a paper ballot at the end either way. So.
Well, looking ahead to 2020, what did the 2018 election results tell us about what we can expect in 2020?
Well, you know, who knows? Every day is different with the Trump administration, right? So
the understatement of the interview.
Yeah, who knows? We've got you know a lifetime of overnights before the 2020 presidential election, but Democrats are already coming out of the woodwork, even at this point, to run for president. So they're going to have a very vibrant Democratic presidential primary. Whether Trump is challenged or not, we don't know.
What's your sense?
Probably
if you were
not.
betting, yeah.
Probably not, really, at least by anyone strong. So I do, from the 2018 elections, I really think that Democrats see Georgia as being in play. Presidentially speaking, even. And, again, depending on where Trump is at, he's never had super high popularity ratings in Georgia, at least from our polling. Very strong with Republicans.
Sure.
But not amongst, independents and Democrats necessarily.
Do you think, polling-wise and historically, do you think Senator David Perdues' political fate is tied to Donald Trump's here in Georgia?
Well, he's certainly been very close to Trump, right? Now, I mean, as we all know, depending on what happens in an election, candidates have a way of separating themselves too sometimes. So he may or may not feel the need, depending on the circumstances of the election, to sort of distance himself from Trump. So I guess that remains to be seen, really.
So I think we mentioned this before we started filming, but you have a new poll out for the AJC. Is this your pre-legislative priority poll?
Right, this is the January poll.
Walk us through those numbers and what it tells us coming out of 2018.
Well, I don't have the numbers in front of me.
Sure,
so with that caveat.
Anybody listening, open a new tab. Go ahead and pull
it. It's on the AJC Poll archive if they want to access it. So we did some favorability ratings, which are very common for politicians, including Nathan Deal, the outgoing governor, Brian Kemp, the incoming governor, Stacey Abrams, David Perdues, Senator, and Donald Trump, and the Affordable Care Act. And so I think the takeaway points from that, now again, this is a survey of the general electorate in terms of these people are active registrants.
So they are this is a poll of registered voters.
It's a poll of registered voters.
Okay.
It's not, we weren't trying to match the electorate in 2018,
okay.
if that makes sense.
Yes.
I mean, obviously Kemp won the election, but his favorability numbers are low. I think it was about 37%.
That's fairly low, especially for an incoming
governor who hasn't done anything yet. So I think there's and again a poll of registered voters is going to include more Democrats now in Georgia than a poll of the electorate. So you're picking up on some of that.
Okay.
I think there's lingering animosity among Democrats. Many of them are dead set against Kemp. And I think that was picked up. Stacey Abrams' numbers were actually above 50% in terms of favorability. And again, that's the partisan balance in the poll is picking up on the partisan balance in the poll to some degree. Even though she lost, she doesn't have anything to prove at this point, right?
Right.
She doesn't have to enter into the governing stage, and so, and she's continued to be very vocal and out front in terms of opposition, especially to Kemp, which is interesting, which may point to her desire to run for governor again. Clearly, I mean, we don't know. We'll find out at some point. Nathan Deal had always had going in the back of last year, majority favorability ratings, and that continued to show. So he's a pretty popular outgoing governor.
Right.
Senator Perdues' numbers were about 45%, which is higher than Kemp. Kemp and Trump's numbers were almost the same. And just to put things in context for anyone watching this, there's a government shutdown going on during this time period, which probably isn't helping Trump's numbers at least. And it's now we've entered into the longest government shutdown in history.
Right.
So that was going on the whole time we were polling, just to add a little context to that.
Does the poll tell you anything about legislative priorities or what Georgians hope to get out or what they're expecting to get out of the legislative session?
Specific questions, you know, about gun control and Medicaid expansion and things that we think that the legislature may at least consider or look into.
Right.
So,
what did you mentioned earlier that the Affordable Care Act was on the poll? Is that how you phrase the question, Affordable Care Act, or
right.
do you mention Affordable Care Act / Obamacare?
No, we just said Affordable Care Act.
Interesting.
Yes. And it had, I believe, just over majority favorability. So that may be something that's changing. There were more than a majority of respondents in the poll that favored Medicaid expansion.
Interesting.
And that tracks with last year even as well. So most, more than a majority of respondents favored raising the purchase age for an assault weapon from 18 to 21 in Georgia. So that was interesting. And there's talk of course, Georgia's a concealed carry state, so you have to have a permit to carry a concealed weapon. And there's at least talk of dropping that part of it, just allowing people to carry on their own, and most people are opposed to that. So not necessarily opposed to the current concealed carry law, but opposed to dropping the
sort of licensing requirement.
Licensing part of it, yes.
Do your polls tell you about the geographic breakdown of South Georgians poll this way, Metro Atlanta voters or respondents poll this way?
Right. I usually do 3 regions, the Metro Atlanta area, and again, that's Clayton, DeKalb, Fulton, Cobb, and Gwinnett. And then North Georgia is above the fall line, minus those counties, and
right.
South Georgia is below the fall line. So, but even in South Georgia, I mean, I don't remember all the different
right.
breakdowns.
Again,
it was interesting that they were not necessarily, South Georgia respondents were not necessarily interested in dropping the licensing requirement for concealed carry. So there wasn't support for that in any of the 3 regions.
So what does this poll tell you? Registered voters, just the general electorate, versus the actual voting public.
Well, they are 2 different things, clearly, right? Because
right.
Kemp's, you look at Kemp's numbers and Abrams' numbers in the poll, and she should have won, right?
Right.
On favorability. Yeah. So again, it goes back, I don't want to overplay this, but things are changing demographically. The registered voter pool is much more diverse and becoming less white and younger as well. And it's more female than the electorate, or those people that actually turn out. So they're 2 different worlds, and so the question is, when are these 2 worlds going to converge, or how long is it going to take?
Well, I will not ask you to make a prediction.
No, I'm not going to make a prediction.
I'm not going to ask you on that.
And things can change as well. This idea that demographics is always destiny may or may not be true. I mean, we could have some new issue come up that completely bisects the electorate in a different way that
right.
we can't even imagine at this point. So.
Right. Yeah. Who could imagine? just a few years ago we would be where we are, nationally
right.
or in the state. So, what projects, apart from the polling over at SRC, are you working on any articles or book length works right now?
Well, I am. It's going very slow, I must say. We're working on
I can sympathize.
Yes, yeah. We're working on a book-length project to try to document Hispanic growth in the South. Again, one of the areas I study is Southern politics,
right.
and this is a very big change. Although I will say Hispanics have always been in Texas, for instance, which is we consider part of the South. But Hispanic growth in other places, even Florida, has been a much more recent phenomenon, and certainly in Georgia it has been, and it's going to affect politics at some point. And so we're trying to to document some of that. So that's one of the things we're working on. At the polling center, you know, a lot of the statewide polling we do is for the AJC, and we have a great relationship with the AJC, but we'd like to try to start doing some of our own polls and then just releasing those to the general public. Again, statewide polls of Georgia.
And what would that require? Is that something that's just a question of funding?
It's really a question of funding. So we're trying to work up to that level.
Well, how much, if you can share that, how much would a poll like the recent one you did of registered voters in Georgia on those key issues, how much does a poll like that cost to commission?
About $15,000,
Wow.
which, you know, to someone listening may sound like an incredible amount of money, and it is a lot of money, but private polling firms are charging much more than that for the same product. So we're a good deal for the dollar, so to speak, but it's not cheap. And, you know, the biggest cost we have is the labor cost, because
Right.
we're using live interviewers. So,
But as you mentioned, you know, you have to pay for that if you want a quality poll.
I believe so,
Essentially.
yes. That's our approach to it. So.
Well, if anybody goes online and looks, they're a very highly rated pollster. I think all your races were called correctly in the last cycle, which is, you know, not nothing, as they say.
I'll take it, certainly, at this point.
Well, Dr. Hood, thank you very much for taking some time this morning to talk through politics and walk us through the process of polling these elections. And on behalf of the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia, thank you very much, sir.
Always glad. Thank you.